and welcome to Soundview Live, the weekly interactive conversation that puts you in touch with today's top business authors. My name is Andrew Clancy, Senior Editor for Soundview, and I'll be your host for this event. Before we introduce today's guest, I'd like to remind everyone that our best events are driven by the questions that you, the audience, submits. To submit a question for today's guest, you can go to the chat window on your player. See that down in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Now, what you'll need to do is you'll need to click Private, then click Leaders and Assistants. If you type your question into the box that appears, you'll be able to click the arrow to send it to us. Today's event is scheduled to run for 60 minutes, so we ask that you please submit your questions throughout the course of the event. If you wait until the very end of the program to ask your question, we may run out of time to answer it. Also, please note that we'll have a couple of specific points during the course of the presentation in which you'll be able to ask questions. So again, we ask you to get your questions in early. Also, one of the most common questions we receive from our listeners is about the availability of the slides from the presentations. Slides from today's presentation will be in viewer-only mode. However, if you stay tuned to the end of the program, we'll provide you with some additional information that will enable you to contact today's speaker about more information that will be presented today. Now for today's guest. Doug Lipp helped create the first international version of the Disney University in Japan at Tokyo Disneyland, and then led the training team of the Disney University at the corporate headquarters of the Walt Disney Company, the Walt Disney Studios. He mentored under a number of Disney University visionaries, including Disney University's founder, Van France. His new book, published by McGraw-Hill, is endorsed by former Disney CEO and Chairman Michael Eisner, President and CEO of Mercedes-Benz USA, Stephen Cannon, and retired U.S. Navy Captain and Soundview Live alum, D. Michael Abrashoff. Soundview is very pleased to welcome the author of Disney U, Mr. Doug Lipp. Doug, welcome to Soundview Live.
Andrew, thank you. And first of all, thanks to all the listeners for joining today, and thanks to the Soundview Live team for putting together an amazing program with the technical support. Without that, this wouldn't be happening. And I have to admit that thinking about the opening of Tokyo Disneyland, this month is actually the 30th anniversary of when that park opened, and I can't believe how time flies. But what's amazing is how the message from 30 years ago is alive and well today in Japan. It's alive and well in Hong Kong. It'll be opening up in Shanghai in 2015, and of course the message in France with Disney is doing well. And I want to mention right off the top that the ideas that I'm going to share today about Disney U and my experience both at Disney and working as a consultant with companies around the world is that the secrets of the Disney University and the secrets of Disney are available to anyone. Many people will challenge me, whether I'm in board meetings with executives or in an audience of 6,000 people, and sometimes you can kind of see their arms folding and you say, you know, I'm not here today to say that I'm from Disney and I have all the answers, because I don't. But I'm also very proud of saying that everything that Disney does well can be done by anyone. It's more about an attitude than about a budget. In fact, you mentioned Van France as the founder of the Disney University and one of my mentors at Disney. He was an irascible man, a very wonderful, brilliant man hired directly by Walt Disney to help start the training division at Disney, and it wasn't even called the Disney University. But Van, we referred to him as kind of a combination of Mary Poppins and Jiminy Cricket and an angry Donald Duck. And the message is that as with Jiminy, as with Mary Poppins, they kind of guide you on the right path. But then sometimes if you get off track, just like an angry Donald Duck, Van would be very quick to let you know what he thought. And one of the first things that I learned from Van was that budget is always the whipping post for why we can't get things done. And he said it's not about budget, a lack of budget, it's about a lack of creativity. And one of the most sought-after Vanisms, and I include this in the book, but I'll share this with the audience today. He talked about too many of us get arthritis of the imagination. Arthritis of the imagination, and we're not willing and able to break out of our patterns. And so really, Disney University, Disney U, the book that I wrote, is more about leadership courage than a how-to. It's more about maintaining one's imagination and creativity despite budgetary challenges, despite economic challenges that all of us have faced in the last 4 and 5 years, and continually improving the product. So moving along with the slide deck, I just wanted to give that precursor to Van, and what an amazing man he was, who took the architecture that Walt Disney and the Imagineers created in the form of Disneyland, and then Walt turned to Van and said, okay, we've created this world-class infrastructure, this world-class facade, this world-class set of rides and attractions with our architects. Now I want you to be the architect of the people that are going to populate the park to make it truly the happiest place on earth. And so what I'd like to think about is this balance of both the hardware and the software. So for all the listeners to think about, what is your product and what differentiates you from all of your competitors? Because quite frankly, every single one of us sell a commodity product. And oftentimes what I see in the marketplace these days is a lack of balance. Sometimes we put all of our eggs in our technology or our product basket, and we've got a very good product. Or sometimes we put more of our eggs in the human basket and the friendly basket, which is fine, but if you have a great product but nasty people, you're in bad shape. If you have really friendly people who are always apologizing about systems that break down, you're in bad shape. And so what I'm seeing in the organizations today that are really, truly head and shoulders above the competition are those that have a compelling product that is reliable, and they're populated with people who are easy and friendly to work with. And this goes from surgeons in hospitals all the way to managers of quick-serve restaurants to sporting goods stores. And it doesn't matter what industry we're in. So I'd like to think about this concept of the magic of the Disney University, the magic of a Disney theme park or a resort. And I want the listeners to think about, from their perspective, based on their product, based on their competitors, what is the equivalent of the magic that they offer. And the reason I have this slide up is people often ask me, well, what is the magic of Disney? Certainly you have all of those wonderful characters, and you've got the Oscar Awards and the Tony Awards and all the accolades that go with show business. And I admit, yes, that's there. But when you get right down to it, it really isn't about that. It's doing the ordinary in an extraordinary fashion. And that's what I want the listeners to think about today is, how does this relate to you? So, for example, when I was in charge of the Disney University at Disney Studios, there is no question that when newly hired employees walk down the hallway to enter the training room, that you're about to have an orientation session, and they see the pictures of the famous characters. They see the picture of Walt Disney with Shirley Temple giving him an Oscar award for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it's got the Oscar that he's winning, but also 7 little tiny Oscars that represent the dwarfs. That is compelling. But if we had been nasty to the attendees, if we had been inattentive, if we had talked about, gosh, you know, everybody at Disney picks up trash, but then when we walked into the park an hour later, the park was dirty and no one was picking up trash, all of that fluff and all of that sexiness would not have meant a thing. So it's really doing the ordinary in an extraordinary fashion. I'll be giving some examples as we go along today that I think will help everyone think about their own business, their own service, their own product line, and think, how does this relate to me, and how can I take the ordinary to an extraordinary fashion, whether it's with my team, my crew, my staff, as well as my products and my customers. So I want to get back to some real specific examples of delivering solutions, delivering value, and providing flawless execution both internally and externally to our teams. And here's an example that we talked about at Disney for years, and it's still a driving force, and it's called Keep Plussing the Show. And again, this gets back to Van's mantra of, let's not get stuck with arthritis of the imagination. And when you think about, when you have a founder like a Walt Disney, imagination you'd think would be automatic, but sometimes we get a little bit long in the tooth. Sometimes we get a little bit tired of doing the same thing over and over again because we are, again, selling a commodity product. So here's an example that I include in one of the chapters in the book. In fact, in Disney U, I call them lessons because really they are lessons from Van, from Walt, and from a number of the I guess I'd call them visionaries. I mean, Disney legends with whom I worked, from CEOs all the way to frontline supervisors. And the man who was in charge of Disney University after Van passed the torch to him shared with me an amazing story of Walt and his idea of plussing the show. Walt loved to walk in the park on weekends. He'd come in and ride the rides, sample the food, interact with customers, we called them guests, interact with our cast members, our employees. And Walt rode on the Jungle Cruise. And he rode every single boat on the Jungle Cruise, and after about an hour or so, he got off the boat, the last boat, and he was really visibly upset. And he pulled the supervisors together on the dock, and he gave them an earful of critical feedback. He said, you know what, we've spent millions of dollars creating this ride, millions of dollars creating the audio animatronic apes and dolls and things that are in the forest, and the boats that we provide the skippers, the captains of the ships, and the costumes. But you know what? Every single boat that I rode on today, said Walt, every single boat, when that boat went through the deep water pool where the hippos jump out, and as the hippos jump out and they spray water, guests are screaming with delight or fright, and they're just into it, right? But every single time, the boat skipper was acting nonchalant. Gosh, I've seen this 5,000 times today. I've seen it 3 million times this summer. Oh, yawn, another day. And he said that is undermining a huge investment. We have to keep plussing the show, whether it's through the hardware, meaning the product, boats, the audio animatronics, or the software, our cast members, our employees who populate this environment. And so for the next week, the team spent hours practicing voice inflection. They spent hours looking surprised so that truly when a guest was on that boat and the hippo jumped out, and even though the skipper had seen it 5 million times that summer, he or she acted surprised. And that's really what I'd like to think about with every business. If I'm about to get my blood drawn by a phlebotomist in a hospital, that's not fun for me, and that's decidedly not as enjoyable as going to a theme park. But certainly if a doctor or someone who's about to perform a procedure on me connects with me at a personal level just for a few seconds, it can lower my blood pressure. And there is empirical evidence in the healthcare field that if we have good bedside manner, that our patients are going to do better, everyone's going to do better. So there is really no excuse for not plussing the show. And again, Walt's admonition to the crew was, this is not an expensive process. Acting surprised is not a budget buster. So I'd like all of the attendees right now and the folks that are listening either individually or with their teams possibly to jot down some ideas about what is the existing status of your quote-unquote show and what are some things that you could do to plus it, things that would not take a whole lot of time, things that would not take a whole lot of budget, and that's the easiest give me right there, but then you can also expand that out to weeks and months that could involve more capital expenditure. But don't get caught up in what Van would say, arthritis of the imagination. You got to have the leadership courage to point your finger at the things that aren't doing well right now and move forward. So speaking of this concept of solution, value, and execution, I'd like to give some examples, again, back to Disney. And Disney certainly has had its tough times. I mean, we almost lost the entire company in the mid-'80s because of an attitude of, we're Disney, we build it, you come. We're Disney, we put our name on it, you buy it. So anyone can fall from a perch. I'm not suggesting that. But from an operational perspective, there is something I like to call Disney's 3X approach for a world-class customer experience. And whether you call your customers clients, whether you call them guests, patients, it doesn't matter. Students, people who pay for your services and without them you wouldn't exist, are your customers. So here are some things that we would share with our newly hired employees at Disney University. And this, in my opinion, is the differentiating factor from a Disney theme park or resort relative to some of the competitors. And it boiled down to these 4 phrases that are on the screen right now. Good show, bad show, on stage, off stage. And this is, without a doubt, the reason why Disney could charge 10, 15, 20% more than a competitive theme park. Why, in fact, actually, competitive theme parks might have had faster rides, but they couldn't compete with the Disney theme park. And this is the example. We would share with our employees that when you're on stage, you've got to have good show. Well, where is on stage? A lot of companies don't have that very clear, and so we would share an example with our newly hired employees about how a family of 4 or 5 or 6, moms, dads, grandmas, uncles, aunts, whoever, are going to go to Disney World or Disneyland for a vacation with their kids, and months before they've told the kids, we're going to go on a vacation. And ever since hearing that, the kids have been amped up beyond belief, shouting about how they are so excited, and mom and dad say, well, where do you want to go? Who do you want to meet? And maybe they say, well, we want to meet Snow White. So we would share this fictional story with our crew members at Disneyland, and again, I write about this extensively in Disney U. And we would say they've spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars getting ready to go to Disney World or Disneyland. And they finally drive or fly across the country. And the kids are still yapping about how they want to meet Snow White. It's just great. Mom and dad finally pull into the parking lot and pay the ridiculous parking fee. Then they pay the more ridiculous fee for the tickets, and they finally get rid of the kids and say, kids, go find Snow White already. Get out of our hair. And I think many listeners can relate to this. Let's now take the story a bit further. Let's say that the kids find Snow White. They've searched for her, and they find her down by Cinderella Castle, and she looks ravishing. And they run up to her, and they pull on her cape and say, Snow White, we love you. Let's say that Snow White turns around, and she's got her wig pushed back on her head, and she's got a big cigarette hanging out of her mouth, and she barks at the kids, what do you want? Can't you see that I'm busy? Do you think at that point mom and dad are standing back saying, oh, honey, don't you love Disneyland, Disney World? Don't you love knowing that last night an army of maintenance personnel and custodial personnel came out and cleaned and fixed every square inch of this park? Of course not. They're livid because Snow White, before their very eyes, has transformed from this beautiful being of their dreams into like a truck driver. And there's nothing wrong with truck drivers. They just don't usually look a lot like Snow White. And that's the point, is that every cast member at a Disney theme park knows when they are on stage, and they know what good show is. And I would argue that most companies that I come into contact with, either as a customer or as a consultant, do not have clarity on this. From the C-suite all the way to the front lines and every intermediate management or supervisory position, oftentimes there is a lack of clarity as to, gosh, when are we on stage? We're a call center. We're never directly in front of a customer, but yes, you are when it comes to your tweets, to your social interactions, to your telephone calls. So I would say that one of the most important things for any business is to make sure that there is absolute clarity in what constitutes good show, appropriate behavior and words, versus bad show, inappropriate, and when you actually are on stage and when you are off stage. And believe me, I have seen Snow White off stage at Disney World in a break area with the wig pushed back, with the cigarette hanging out of her mouth, but that's okay because that is off stage, and all of us have to have a place to go to let our hair down. So really, the point that I'm making here, and I mentioned it earlier, is our competitive edge is that the rides don't break down, and Snow White never has a bad day. And that's that balance of hardware, software. In the medical fields, that's a balance of clinical care and emotional care. It's heart and it's technology. The other thing I'd like to consider with regards to creating a wonderful team that's engaged is to make sure that the phrase that is bandied about quite a bit of empowerment. And again, I would suggest that most companies do not have clarity on what empowerment means. Everybody nods their head in agreement that, yes, empowerment's a good thing, but when I ask frontline employees, when I ask middle managers, when I ask senior people what empowerment constitutes and who can do what by when, oftentimes there's a lack of clarity. And one of the things that drives me nuts, and I'm sure many of the listeners, is when we go out to spend our hard-earned money for goods and services and something goes wrong. We at Disney said when something doesn't go according to script. And that's always going to happen. And you come across an employee or a supervisor who shrugs his or her shoulders and says, I don't know, I got to ask my boss. And then the boss comes over and asks you the same question that's been asked by 4 or 5 other employees. And after a while, what's more upsetting is not the original problem, but the process you've got to go through to get some answers. So here's an example that we use at Disney all the time that made a huge difference, and we called it popcorn empowerment. And the bottom line is most guests coming into Disneyland or Disney World are going to buy their kids either a soda or some popcorn, and as soon as they buy that $4 or $5 box of popcorn and hand it to that 4-year-old kid, what happens? Somebody bumps into the child trips, and they fall, and within seconds you've got popcorn spilled all over the ground and a screaming 4-year-old child, screaming at the top of his lungs, even to the point where it gets even beyond the screaming. It's the silent scream, which we all know is the worst. So here's what we did with our employees. We said, let's give this stuff away. Now, I'm not suggesting that comping and giving things away is the all-ending panacea for solving problems, but this is where we realize that because the base cost of popcorn or soda is so small, the margins on popcorn and soda are robust, to say the least. Maybe a quarter is what it costs the company. Let's let our cast members give the stuff away. Because really, when you think about it, that 4-year-old child is crying over a box of popcorn, and then odds are great that mom and dad are yapping at the child. Why did you spill that popcorn? And then the mom and dad start to argue with each other. Why did you buy that in the first place? It's too expensive. And then you might have 4 or 5 other families that are surrounding this environment, all looking on and crying and thinking, oh my gosh, look at this poor kid. That's bad show on stage, and you might have 14 or 15 guests negatively affected by this. So we told our cast, give the stuff away. So now let's say that you're a sweeper on Main Street. You're an hourly employee, 17 years of age, and you hear this child screaming over by the popcorn kiosk. Hey, you kind of know what's going on, so you know that you're empowered to skirt around the group, the audience, the guests, get a box of popcorn at the kiosk, make a beeline to the kid, and then kneel down because you've been trained in the Disney University that kneeling down gets you on the same eye level as that child. And then something miraculous happens when you say to the child, is that your popcorn on the ground? Well, the kid sees a non-parental figure now face-to-face, and they shut up. They're quiet. That's win number 1. You've already reduced the anxiety on stage. And then you say, do you mind if I tell you a secret? And then this child looks at you with crocodile tear-filled eyes, and they nod their head in agreement. Now I own that child. And then you say, hey, buddy, do you mind if I tell you a secret from, then you pause for dramatic effect, from Mickey Mouse? And you look around, and now you own the child, his or her parents, and 12 or 13 other guests. Now it's turned into a stage production. So what was moments ago a disaster has now turned into a positive show. And then you whip out this free box of popcorn saying, yeah, Mickey Mouse told me he saw you drop your popcorn, and he wants to know if it's okay if you get a free box of popcorn from him. Well, you know that before you get those words out of your mouth, mom and dad are saying, give my kid the popcorn already. So for 25 cents, I have 13, 14, 15 guests who are thrilled. They're most likely going to talk more about that interaction when they go home than the multi-million-dollar ride system on Space Mountain that kept them alive. We have a cast member, an employee who's walking 10 feet off the ground, now looking for other opportunities where guests are having a bad time and striving to turn that around, as opposed to seeing a guest who's upset, doing a 90-degree about-face and walking away. So I'd like to ask each of the attendees to think about the concept of empowerment in their businesses, in their offices, in their factories, and to what extent is it really crystal clear what people can and can't do. And I'm not suggesting you have anarchy and everybody can do anything. It's just at every hierarchical level there has to be clarity as to who can do what by when, and then how do you escalate it when you've reached your limit. So again, to repeat what I've talked about so far is it's really all about balance. And where do you as an individual, as a team, as a company, as a store, as a restaurant, as a clinic, as a corporation stand? Moving along, I'd like to think about, again, Van France's idea of avoiding arthritis of the imagination. And I alluded to this earlier. And we at Disney fell into the trap of not being willing to change. And as I mentioned earlier, in the 83, 84 time frame, we almost lost the company 3 times due to our inability or our reluctance to change. And so kind of at the crux of writing Disney U is I was sharing how we at Disney did things that worked, but it's also a revelation of some of the challenges that we ran into. And one of the most poignant lessons I learned from Van was that despite the longevity, despite the history, despite the legacy. I mean, Disney was formed in 1923. Disneyland started in 1955. With that kind of legacy comes tremendous pressure to hold the line. And one of the things that we learned when Walt Disney passed away, something that we lost that a lot of organizations lose, is we then try to appease the founder in his or her absence, in his or her death, or wherever they went. And I remember when I was writing DisneyU, last summer I interviewed the chairman, the just retired chairman of Walt Disney Imagineering, a guy named Marty Sklar, brilliant guy, and he ran the Imagineering engineering team for decades. And he talked about working with Walt Disney, and he said Walt had the uncanny ability to have one foot in the past and one foot in the future at any given time. And that's really the example that Van talked about, is he never got arthritis of the imagination. He was always mindful of the legacy that he was maintaining, but not against upsetting the apple cart. And that's one of the things that I see in a lot of organizations that don't have succession plans, is that some member of the team leaves due to whatever reason, and then the organization is out of balance. So I can't reinforce enough the idea that we as individuals, we as organizations must be willing to change, get out of our ruts, or we must be willing to perish. And we at Disney kind of learned that the hard way. Another balance to think about is certainly getting enough people through the system to make a profit, to justify headcount, to justify whatever you have to do on a spreadsheet. But again, back to this balance concept, is that we at Disney never lost sight of the fact that even though we had to get masses of people through restaurants, masses of people through attractions, masses of people through turnstiles, you don't want to lose the one-to-one interaction, the quality. Even though you have to maintain your efficiencies and you got to keep people moving, you don't want to lose the heart, the empathy. So I'd like to think about, for example, even on a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean, which is one of the most enjoyable rides to work on because you can actually be a little bit gruff and people just think you're being a good pirate. But the idea was that we had to get 16 people into boats, 4 rows of 4. And the challenge that we would have sometimes is that guests wouldn't want to sit in the front row or the back row. They'd have specific ideas. Well, you can stand there and you can negotiate with the guest all day long, and you can be really empathetic and have high one-to-one quality. But if I'm discussing where people want to sit for 10, 15 minutes, the lines outside are getting longer and longer, so I'm losing my efficiencies. I'm losing my ability to deal with masses of people. So one of the things that we had in many of our attractions was the pre-show, and you could actually get guests to step off to the side. Say, folks, I tell you what, you want to step into the pirate's lair for a moment, and the kids would always say, yeah, we do. Great. You want to get the bottleneck out of the way. And you say, I'll come back to you in just a couple of moments, but I can do 4 in the front row, and I can do 4 in the second, 4 in the third, 4 in the fourth. That's not going to change, but I don't want to go toe-to-toe with the guest right now. That's not good show for me or for the guest. But here's the point. We knew that those kinds of questions and guests were going to show up, and they were going to slow down the system. So let's have another system that allows us to get them out of the way in a nice way and then keep the efficiencies and the masses going. And then after a couple of boatloads go by, I know the kids are getting anxious, and they're over there negotiating with Mom and Dad. Hey, Mom and Dad, we all 16 can't sit in the front row. Let's do what the pirates said, and let's do 4, 4, 4, and 4. So then you go back to the guests and say, so, Mom and Dad, have you figured out what you want to do? Yeah, we think we'll do 4 in the front row, 4 in the second. We can't all fit in the front row, which was their original proposal. So now I, as a pirate, don't have to be the bad guy, and I've kept my efficiencies going. So, again, when things don't go according to script, when guests don't move along as rapidly as you like, or when guests ask the silly question, what time is the 3 o'clock parade? Is it really that silly of a question, and can you predict that well in advance so that you have a response either operationally or interpersonally? So what I'm suggesting, and what I write about extensively in DisneyU, in fact, DisneyU is not a how-to book. It's how Disney University develops some of the world's most engaged, friendly, loyal, customer-centered employees. And it's all about creating an organizational culture, either in a small division or a worldwide organization. And what I focus on a lot, and what Van France taught me and so many legends at Disney that were my bosses, was we absolutely have to communicate. And so what I was mentioning earlier is that when we at Disney got a little bit big for our britches and started to think that we're Disney, we build it, you come, we inadvertently built walls between us and the marketplace because we weren't willing to go out and ask people what they wanted. We're Disney. We tell you, you buy it. We know more about family entertainment than families, so just sit back and enjoy the show. And what we learned when we almost lost the company is that we had to start asking customers what they wanted from their perspective. We might have internal metrics that suggest we have on-time delivery, but is the delivery person friendly? We might have metrics that say our products are being delivered without being broken, but is the crate that we deliver it in so massive and so big that it takes the customer 4 or 5 hours to take it apart, and then the customers are upset because now they've got a pile of garbage on their loading dock. So some of the things that we realized was we had to go out and ask customers what they wanted, and they came back, and these are the 4 things that our customers told us that mattered the most and why they would pay a premium to come to a Disney park. They wanted friendliness. They wanted cleanliness. They wanted a safe environment, and they wanted it to be done consistently every single day. And this was mind-blowing to us. Nowhere in here is there a concerted cry that says, we want faster, sexier rides. We want friendly cast members. We want people's costumes to be clean. We want the bathrooms to be clean. We want it to be a safe environment. And when I recommend you to my friends, my family, my colleagues, that this is a great place, I don't want them to go next month or next year and have a bad experience because it's going to reflect negatively on me. So do this consistently. So my question to all of you is, what is your differentiating factor? How do you attract and hold on to loyal guests, customers, patients? How do you attract and hold on to loyal employees? And we found that by following these 4 directives from our customers, that we now had clear marching orders. What are your marching orders? And when's the last time you've truly interacted with the frontline employee, the frontline guest, to ask them why they prefer to come to you versus a competitor? Part of this concept of culture is that we always have different subcultures in any organization. What I'm showing here are these vertical silos of green, blue, and gray. Those could be different shifts. Those could be day shift, night shift. Those could be different parts of the country or the province or the city within which you have operations. It could be younger employees versus older employees. It could be different linguistic, cultural backgrounds that we have more and more contact with as the globe continues to shrink. And instead of letting those things turn into silos, I would argue that the strongest teams have crystal clear core values that allow for cultural differences. So, for example, I mentioned Pirates of the Caribbean a few moments ago. Fun ride to work on. You can be kind of aggressive with guests, and they think you're being a good pirate. But you know what? 3 hours later, you might be working on the attraction called It's a Small World After All, and that's a totally different culture. So one of the things that we allowed at Disney is, how does a pirate create the happiest place on Earth versus how does someone on Small World versus someone at Space Mountain versus someone in one of the restaurants. Let's let them be themselves as long as they are agreeing to and abiding by, we are all here to create the happiest place on Earth. Now, certainly there must be guidelines, but let's not be robotic in how all of us present ourselves to our guests, because a pirate is not going to say, certainly, it's my pleasure. That's not pirate-like, and so that's not plussing the show. I'm not a big fan of robotic, it's been my pleasure. I'm a fan of having responses to our guests that allow for individual employees' personalities to come out as long as it falls within the guidelines of an organization's values. So speaking of that, I'm jumping ahead to this culture slide. What I see in a lot of organizations is they will say, well, you know, Disney, you have these fancy, sexy terms for employees. You call them cast members. You have fancy, sexy terms for customers. You call them guests. And you have costumes that you wear, not uniforms. And what I see, unfortunately, all too often is in an attempt to create an organizational culture, some teams of executives spend way too much time on verbs and nouns. They spend so much time on how are we going to address our customers and our employees, as opposed to let's take a look at the core of our culture. So metaphorically, in my mind, a lot of organizations are doing the equivalent of slapping a coat of paint on a run-down building, expecting that to bring it up to code or to make it sturdy again. And it's not that at all. It's looking at the foundation. So one of the things that I focus on in every lesson, meaning every chapter in Disney U, is another huge lesson I learned from Van that he learned from Walt Disney. And it was the 4 circumstances that drive the success of Disney U and of Disney. And I would like to think that every organization could identify their own. The first thing that Van talked about, again, it's getting back to avoiding the arthritis of the imagination, was be willing to innovate, be willing to break what's not broken and put it back together again. And as I mentioned, we forgot that for a period of time at Disney and paid a dramatically ugly price by almost losing the company. So be willing to change. Have leaders that are willing to take a risk. Have leadership courage to say what's on your mind and to create new approaches. The success of Disney University is due solely to this second one, if nothing else, is overt, enthusiastic leadership support. Many of the training functions and organizational development teams that I come into contact with have programs that are really good, but they don't have executives that support them. They might have a blast off for 2 or 3 weeks, and then things kind of go by the wayside. Overt support of educational programs is the reason why Disney University succeeds. It's not those fancy costumes and the characters and the Academy Award pictures that I mentioned earlier. It's when the chairman of Walt Disney Studios walks into a training program and spends 15 minutes with other managers discussing the creative process in creating Little Mermaid and the creative process in marketing and selling that product. That captures people's attention much more than a non-executive talking about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that all executives should attend all training programs, but without a doubt, throughout the organization at Disney, executives participate in training programs, which lends tremendous support. In fact, that's one of the things that Michael Eisner wrote about when he had endorsed Disney U. He talked about when he came on board at Disney, even as the CEO, he had to go through Disney U to learn about the company culture. Everyone goes through it. No one is given a pass, so to speak. The next thing that I see in the greatest organizations are the ones that do have education at the core of their culture, constantly learning. Be willing to learn all the time, and this is something that Walt helped set up even in the earliest days of the Disney Studios. And then finally, let's have some fun. There is no reason why we can't have fun and educate at the same time. In fact, one of my most favorite quotes from Walt that I have in Disney U, I have on the inside jacket. It says, "When the subject permits, we let fly with all the satire and gags at our command. Laughter is no enemy to learning." And I don't care if it's talking about scientists who work in a laboratory or high school teachers who are teaching high school kids. There is always a place for entertainment and education hand in hand. So I'd like to ask the attendees, what is the culture of their organization? I mean, culture at the end of all this, with all these details and all these descriptions, is what people do every day without being told. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I enjoyed the most training new hires at Disneyland was at the end of an 8-hour orientation, we still took them out into the park for about a 30-minute tour during business hours. And what we talked about in the university about cleanliness and friendliness and safety, that's fine, but it's still in a classroom. And what cemented all that in place was when I would take my new hires into the park, and they would see multiple examples of executives walking to and from meetings, or other cast members walking to and from their breaks, bending over and picking up trash. And you know, at that moment, when those new cast members see that happening, in their minds are thinking, oh my gosh, what they said back there in the Never Never Land of Disney University actually comes true. So what is the culture in your company or department? And if you're at the head of the organization, it's definitely a reflection of you. Culture, without a doubt, always, always, always starts at the top. and it happens either by design or by benign neglect. Either way, culture is going to happen, and without a doubt, it always starts at the top. So if things are going as you like, that's great. If things are going other than that, if they're not going so well, you might want to look in the mirror and think about what you're bringing to that party. So really, Andrew, I'm starting to go to a point of wrap-up, and I know that we had talked about asking questions earlier, but I want to ask the audience to think about now taking it home a little bit, and what would they like to do? And I asked them at the very outset of the program to think about what are some things that you do that differentiate from the competition to attract and hold on to both employees as well as customers. And now I'd like to think about a more specific